Hello, I'm Toycat, and Friday the 21st of March 2025 was meant to be a momentous occasion for the UK because it was going to be the first time in 200 years that the sun had set on all of British territory. This is because the UK agreed to transfer sovereignty of the British Indian Ocean Territory to Mauritius, and this would mean that as soon as the Southern Hemisphere had their winter and the British Antarctic Territory went dark for a while, there would be a gap of an hour between the westernmost and the easternmost territory having their suns rise. In other words, there'd be a temporary moment where the UK and every piece of territory owned by it would be dark at the same time, and so the sun was finally going to set. And if you're curious, did that happen? The answer is, well, no actually, and I figured I would give a brief update on what actually happened, because if you don't follow UK domestic politics, you might have just assumed like, oh yeah, it probably went ahead at some point, but nope, this is still British Indian Ocean Territory, and it's not a fun degree to do with Trump again. This is actually its name, although actually that's an interesting point to mention, your boy over there, because it was often thought at the time the immediate defense of the UK agreeing with Mauritius to actually go ahead and transfer sovereignty was like, oh yeah, well this is British Indian Ocean Territory on paper, but in reality most most things that happen there are at the American international base. If you actually look at anything on the island, it's going to be US based stuff, because this is actually an opportunity for the US to have a military base in the area which they lease from the UK. In exchange, the UK gets certain nuclear technology from the US. It's an interesting deal from both sides, but this means that if you have a particularly hawkish president, then it's not going to go very well. However, interestingly enough, the President of the United States says, I think we'll be inclined to go along with your country, which is wild to say, for a president who is so often beating the drum of what you might call nationalism, what you might call America first. The idea of like beating the drum of like, oh yeah, we know what to do, saying, oh yeah, I think the UK knows exactly what they're doing here, is kind of nuts. Even if we just to hear his words here, he even sounds pretty genuine when he says it.
About 140 years, actually. It's a long time. And I think we'll be inclined to go along with your country. Yeah, I think it sounds...
I'm fascinated by the fact that that's true, and yeah, so as a result, Donald Trump is not vetoing the deal. The United States is entirely on board with this, and so too, seemingly, is Mauritius. And so here's the question, what happens then? So if the UK agrees to transfer the territory, if Mauritius agrees to accept the territory, and if the current actual occupiers agree, yeah, it's a good deal, and if the president is gonna go along with our country, then what has gone wrong there? Well, the simple answer to this question is geopolitics, and the more complex answer is the mixture of geopolitics and domestic politics. Why is that? Well, basically, the UK didn't just agree to hand over the islands, we've agreed to hand over the islands and then lease back the territory we currently own for £18 billion. And that is, ultimately, in the grand scheme of government, not a huge amount, especially not over that time period, but it is also the UK saying, what if we gave up territory and also gave up a ton of money? And the reason that becomes complicated is, like I said, due to domestic and geopolitics colliding in a messy way. The domestic political situation is the fact that, well, I think in the UK it can be well said by anyone who's lived here over the last decade that we're kind of in a pickle, you could say. Basically, if you look at government spending in the UK, it's about 1.2 trillion pounds. And if you look at government, if you look at taxes that they raise, it's about 1.1. This means we need to borrow every year 127 billion, not to invest in cool new things, that's just to meet our obligations. And if you actually look at what our obligations are, it's actually really tragic. We actually spend about, according to this right here, 104 billion pounds a year on debt interest. That's right, we borrow 120 billion pounds a year and we spend the overwhelming majority of it on financing our previous debt. A lot of people in the UK are like, oh yeah, well we've had small government, conservatives in power for 13 years, and it's like, no, small government is not the you could be pretty let's be real, what we have right now is a humongous government that is spending 1.2 trillion a year, and even though we raise taxes every year, which is actually technically true, not true, what we do is we freeze tax thresholds while incomes go up, but as we are raising taxes every year, we still don't come anywhere close to our spending. People do not like the amount we spend, people feel like you don't get very good public services in the UK, and maybe you could argue that's because we spend what we have poorly or whatever, But the point is that people have been feeling this squeeze for a while. Every year we've been cutting government spending, and every year we've been austeritizing ourselves, is what the mainstream media will tell you. But if you actually look at the numbers, it's like, yeah, we raise a crazy amount of money, 1.1 trillion pounds from the British public. That equates, by the way, to £40,000 per household, and then we spend it in a way that apparently most people don't seem to like, based on the fact that we end up in a situation where everyone thinks that things just aren't that great in the UK. And so in other words, we've been going through all what you might call rounds of austerity, but rounds of trying to get the public sector under control. This is a very, very hard thing to do without deeply upsetting people, and so we're in a situation where everyone feels like they're being squeezed on taxes and then not getting enough from their spending, despite the fact that there's over £1 trillion of both. That is a relevant fact, because if you then tell those same people, yeah, we don't have the money for, like, I don't know, a new hospital, we don't have the money, we haven't like cut your welfare, or like, whatever else it may be, while you're coming out with all these public statements about how you have to cut costs, you're also saying, what if we gave 18 billion to a foreign country, and get this, what we would get in exchange is we give up our territory? Isn't that like a great deal? We could give up land, and then we could pay someone to have that land that we're giving. Oh man, this is such a great deal. And so as a result, a lot of people domestically are upset by this, and internationally it's become a bit of a spicy issue. Why is that the case? Because the actual power struggle in the Mauritius deal, according to the Telegraph over here, if we'll take their word for it for the UK news website of the year, I'm going to use their word for it because they do describe quite well here, at least, the fact that there is a struggle not between the UK and Mauritius, or the UK and the US and Mauritius, but really the deeper struggle is between China and India. The two countries are ultimately the two most populated on the planet, and at some point in time, whatever that time horizon will be the biggest players on basically anything you can imagine. And so China's goal is to be the bigger of the two, and India's goal is to more or less prevent that. New Delhi has particularly been worried about China's pursuit of the string of pearls strategy of encircling India through financial infrastructure projects and all of the other, as a precursor to more pronounced and permanent Chinese naval presence in the region. In other words, the debt trap diplomacy being used as a way to build some permanent military bases, which, if China does intend to be a bigger world power, might be a concern for them. This is one of the most interesting things to me, that India and China don't get along in any major spheres, and India in particular is worried about what is going down with China. And so as a result, when you get to territories like this, and when you have the Chagos Islands deal, which many people worry about as being related to China, you get to a very interesting position. For what it's worth, India has actually been one of the sides making sure that Mauritius gains control of their archipelago. Partially, they say on surface it's because of their principled stance on decolonization, but it's actually because it's in India's interest to ensure that the US maintains a military presence in the Indian Ocean. India, in other words, is very, very worried about the Chinese presence in the region and wants the US to be involved. And I think that they're almost arguing like, yeah, well, if the US has control of this territory more directly by leasing it from, say, Mauritius directly, or by having a more direct link to the land, that would be a good thing for us, because we are very worried about Chinese military presence growing in our region. This is the most interesting story. Again, I feel like the most interesting story in the world, as it relates to most people who are watching this channel, is probably the Arctic. This is going to be the region that Russia has a key edge over everyone else on, and it's something the rest of the world needs to catch up on, whether that's Canada, Greenland, or the Nordics, you could say. But ultimately, the much bigger story in terms of the world population is China and India. China is at a fun situation where they have grown as a country. They've gone from being, I think that I heard a really fun fact that they surpassed their 1100s economy recently only in the 1970s, and they've grown from being like a poor country to a middle income country to getting to the point where they will be a wealthy, at least in the cities, there are lots of very wealthy people in China, whereas India has been struggling to make that jump from lower middle income to upper middle income. And this is something that is a bigger struggle in the world of, if you have two equally sized countries by population, the next big factor is going to be the military and the economy, and India kind of struggles on both those issues. So the reason the British Indian Ocean Territory is going through some issues is because domestically, people feel the squeeze and the idea of, wait, we're going to borrow £18 billion to give it to a foreign nation. People feel the squeeze of that. And internationally, there's a lot of different, the fact that there are 5 different fingers in this pie, there's Mauritius, the United States, China, and India, I think just means this is going to go very slowly. And a part of me, looks at this and says, well, that's probably a stalling tactic to have it never happen at all. But I do think that actually, ultimately, it's just going to be one of those very slow deals. And that is the perfect thing to do as Prime Minister. Set the ticking time bomb for a 5-year, hit snooze on that alarm for like, 2 to 5 years time, and hope to God that everyone's forgotten about it by the time it goes off, or even luckier, hope that the next guy who gets in charge can do it instead. Anyway, yeah, this has been the situation, and this is why the sun has still not set on the British Empire. It's been over 200 years and counting, and if we can just make it through to the winter, then we could give it up and get all the way through to another year. And that's all I'm saying. Sun will never set. Rule Britannia. Britannia rule the waves. Anyway, I think in terms of an actual, if you want to know like the actual situation here, I think it's really hard to argue that it's in any meaningful way decolonization. If you're giving territory that is, first of all, thousands of miles from the country you're giving it to, this is the British Indian Territory, this is Mauritius, I think it's especially hard if you're not doing it in favor of the people who live there. The Chagosians, I think the real crime, like to actually, rather than just being like, yeah, UK, let's hold on to our territory, the real people who suffered here are the Chagosians, but they were already deported and no one has intentions to put them back there. The morally right thing to do would be allow Chagosians to go back to even have their own country, you could say. No one's suggesting letting them have their own country. No one's suggesting putting them back. Some people have suggested the idea of compensation, and indeed, apparently, apparently there was some in 1977. But the truth is that actual reparations are or not reparations, but even. Yeah, actually, it's within their lifetime. Fixing this now is the best thing that you could realistically do there. And the second best thing that you could do is, work out a situation where everyone is actually, I don't know, like, I guess my real take here is that the real way that you can fix decolonization is with decolonization, not by handing a foreign country a bunch of money to continue the status quo. No one is happier that way. That's not a reparation to the people who deserve it. That is paying off a foreign government to not, to shut up, more or less. Is that what you want as a country? Well, there's the interesting question, isn't it? Speaking of interesting questions, I hope that you have all enjoyed this video. During the course of it, I actually feel like I've changed my mind a little bit on this. I feel like, 18 billion, it's a silly amount to borrow. But if you think about it, right, I'm such a contrarian, I can't finish my own video about being a contrarian on myself. For 140 years, if you think about how little that is in 140 years' time, if they hadn't agreed to pay it all at once, if they agreed to stagger the money and fix in the payment terms, that would have been really clever, personally. But 18 billion pounds for 140 years. Presumably, a lot of that money is coming back from the US, and presumably that then has the benefits of, making the UK look like cool guys, despite the fact that they're not giving up a whole bunch. Is that a benefit? You tell me. But ultimately, yeah, I think it should be on Mauritius. If they wanted to actually be successful in this deal, rather than talking about how they're like, oh, why hasn't the money arrived yet? Talk about like, oh yeah, we've been planning to help the Chagosians go back to their home. That would be the real plan, wouldn't it? But I feel like that's not what's been going on. And such is the world of geopolitics, as the people are second to the grander political strategy. And so, the sun has not set on the British Empire, but it might do soon, but that'll be hopefully the next guy's problem. Speaking of whom, I've been IBX2Cat, and I guess it'll be IBX3Cat, who hopefully has to report on this when it finally happens. And second channel, don't care. Goodbye.